Also,
Right, if all this black magic worked, you should be seeing my title slide about now.
yeah, we are.
Great. Good evening, everyone. I have to start with a disclaimer. These days I'm as serious as has been. Other things have kind of taken over my life, and I long back to ham radio, but I haven't had the opportunity to play with it much. But I do continue to maintain some records that compare our performance to other people's performance, and I think maybe I still remember a few tricks that might be useful. I'm going to start just talking about what contesting really is. What's the purpose of contesting? Some types of contests, some practical elements of operating a contest. Talking about a practical contest that we tried at one point in a face-to-face setting, which isn't going to work in this online environment, but which might still be a useful exercise. And I'll talk a little about how to get started and how to win. Right, what is a contest? Firstly, contests are typically over a limited period. Some are very short, like 3 hours, some are 24 hours, some are 48 hours, and one could even stretch the definition to take in contests that run over a longer period, like 1 year. In fact, Vic Clark W4KFC, who was the president of the ARRL at one point and who was a great contester, even classed DXCC as a contest for slow operators. Of course, DXCC runs over a lifetime. So if you regard that as a contest too, then I suppose we could greatly expand the definition. Typically in a contest, the idea is to make contacts and to exchange information with the other person. In addition to your call sign, also typically something like a sequence number, RST, in other words, your signal report, maybe your zone, either your CQ zone or your ITU zone, maybe the state in which you live, your age, the age at which you were first licensed, or whatever. It varies from contest to contest, but the idea is to transmit information in addition to your call sign. And typically most contests assess that the accuracy of that exchange in addition to the accuracy of the call signs exchange to determine who the greatest operator is. The idea is to maximize a score, and the idea is that the score will serve to provide direct comparison, in other words, to determine who the greatest is and also how other people rank. What is the purpose of contesting? Well, our president has mentioned that there are a lot of contests, and in fact, even I regard some of the contests as an irritation. They take over a part of the band and impact on other operating, which is not always welcome. Of course, I feel very differently about the major contests where obviously they must just make space. But one important purpose of contesting is fun. It's a lot of fun, make a lot of contacts very quickly, hear some very rare stations on the air that are just as keen to talk to you as you are to talk to them, which is a nice change because very often rare stations that you want to talk to are swamped by hundreds of people calling and you might never get the opportunity to talk to them. A second purpose is technical improvement. Contesting gives you a great incentive to improve your station. Higher antennas, better antennas, bigger amplifiers, better audio shaping, better technique, better endurance. There are all sorts of things that you could improve to improve your contest performance. Operating efficiency is a very important target for contesting. Now, let me take a step back and say, why does the ITU, which is an agency of the United Nations, actually give us lots of radio spectrum? You will be aware that in a recent radio spectrum auction, companies paid hundreds of millions of rand for radio spectrum. The radio spectrum is in principle extremely valuable, and yet amateur radio has radio spectrum pretty much free of charge. We do pay a little license fee, but it's completely disproportionate to the value of that spectrum, and commercial interests are very keen to take over bands like the 70 centimeter band and the 2 meter band and so on. Why do we get these frequencies for free? Well, the ITU has very clearly defined justification for it. Forms. Firstly, amateur radio is a great resource in terms of technical capabilities. Many of the technical breakthroughs that have happened during the history of radio have been made by amateurs. And so having a continuous series of breakthroughs and also having a pool of people who actually know something about radio is a great asset to a country and also to the world. And secondly, the existence of lots of radio stations that are not dependent on infrastructure is a great benefit. We've heard about things like tsunamis and earthquakes and various other natural catastrophes where existing infrastructure like cell networks have been destroyed, and the only way to communicate is through portable operations by radio amateurs who can set up a station quite quickly and pass some essential traffic. So if we become more efficient and our stations become better, we have a reason to exist. If we allow ourselves to become complacent and to become appliance operators without technical skills and without adequate radio stations, we do not have a reason to exist. So we could say that contesting greatly assists in giving amateur radio a foothold in the world. From a personal point of view, it's a great way to chase countries, prefixes, and so on for awards. You can make a lot of contacts very quickly, very efficiently, and without having to sit around and listening every single day. So contests are great for that purposes too. Also, if you win, it's a lot more fun. There are certificates, medals, and trophies if you need those, but many of us function mostly for the thrill of the chase, and winning a contest is a lot more fun than losing. By the way, I have a lot of experience of both. I suppose the reason I was invited is because I've won a few times, but I've also lost more than enough times to understand that part of the equation too. There's a picture of a contest station. Now, you will probably agree that there's evidence of some compulsive behavior there, but to me it looks like the second tower from the right has a full-size 3-element 40-meter Yagi, and the others are an assortment of maybe 10, 15, and 20-meter beams. And then some wire, and they probably also see there are some open wire feeders. So whoever built this little station is probably fairly serious about being competitive, and they could probably also set up a great emergency communication system should the need arise. Here's a picture of an inside of a station. This is CN2AA. This is a temporary station that was only built for the weekend to win a contest. So those operators are probably manning 6 different frequency bands simultaneously, 10, 15, 20, 40, 80, and 160. And you can see some fairly fancy footwork to try and filter the signals so that there's no mutual interference. I often wonder why they call it wireless. that picture doesn't seem wireless at all. Right, contest types. There are local contests. They've been mentioned. The Radio League has some local contests, both on HF and VHF. There are DX contests, where the emphasis is on long-distance contacts, international contacts. There are VHF and above contests. These would typically take place on 6 meters and above, 2 meters and up into the UHF and even higher spectrum. There's Field Day, which is basically only open to portable stations. You can contact the portable stations, but the competition or the contest is actually only between stations that are established specifically for the contest. And typically the rules state that you're not allowed to use any permanent structures. So you have to take your own antennas, your own towers, your own housing, something like a caravan or a tent or some sort of a portable building, and also a portable power source such as a generator or solar cells or AA batteries or whatever takes your fancy. And then there are specialty contests. These might include EME, Earth, Moon, Earth, or Moon Bounce, digital contests, RTTY contests, which are obviously a specific type of digital contest, low band contests, which might only be on 1.8 megahertz or maybe 3.5 megahertz, and then club contests, where a lot of participants from the same club might participate. Yes, another piece of evidence of compulsive behavior. This was W5UN's 2-meter moon bounce station, 32 Yagis, each with something like 16 elements or so horizontally, and also with about 10 elements vertically. So he had the ability to switch between them. And either way, you would have 32 Yagis pointing at the moon simultaneously. By the way, this antenna was so efficient that he could connect his handy-talkie, his 2-meter FM handheld radio to this antenna and say hello, and then hear hello coming back from the moon. In other words, he was, despite the 210 odd decibels of path loss, he could hear himself with full quieting on FM using 2 or 3 watts of output with this particular antenna. And he was also able to work very modest stations. He was the first person to make 100 countries on 2 meters. And I and a few of my associates actually gave him 4 of the last 5 countries that he needed to complete 100 on 2 meters, using very modest equipment, single Yagis and perhaps 150 watts or so. So we were able to travel to adjacent stations, and that's just an indication of the performance of this antenna system of his. I don't think we did much of the footwork of the heavy lifting except to travel to neighboring countries. But the gain was all on his end. There are different entry categories in contests. The single operator categories involve a single person doing all the operating. So this person has to transmit, receive, log, turn antennas, deal with pesky neighbors, and make food, go to the bathroom, and all other operating functions. There are also subcategories. For example, you can be an all-band entrant, or you can be a single band entrant. You might only participate on 28 megahertz, or only on 21, or only on 1.8 megahertz, or whatever. Rookie, which means that you're a relatively inexperienced amateur and you're competing only against other relatively inexperienced amateurs. And then some of the contests have categories like tri-bander and wires, which means that you are not directly competing with other people that have super stations, but instead only with other people with a similarly modest setup. There are multi-operator categories where you have more than one person operating, and there are different sets of rules like multi-1, multi-2, and multi-multi. Multi-multi is like CN2AA, which I showed you previously, where you might have 6 transmitters going simultaneously, and you can, in principle, have any number of operators operating those 6 radios. Multi-single means there's only a single transmitter with more than one operator, and multi-2 means there are 2 transmitters that may transmit simultaneously, but there are restrictions in terms of the frequency bands and so on, and sometimes also a time limit, which means you're not allowed to move from one band to another all that frequently. All of these categories introduce very specific strategic decisions into the equation, and they can be a lot of fun. Competitive multi-single or multi-2 is a very big project, and doing it properly is really a challenge, and it could be real fun for a club or for a bunch of friends. There are also different power categories. In general, the high power category is restricted to 1.5 kilowatts PEP output, which is regardless of the country's actual power limit. So in our case, we have, last time I checked, we had 1 kilowatt PEP output limits. And so we can only participate with 1 kilowatt, but a country that has 2 or 3 or 4 kilowatts as their power limit must restrict themselves to 1.5 kilowatts. So right now we're on a fairly level playing field with the world, with being allowed 1 kilowatt of BEP output is only about 1 or 2 decibels down on the contest limit, so we can be very competitive. In my early days, we had a 150 watt DC input limit, which only allowed us to run about 100 watts of output on CW and FM and RTTY and so on, and 400 watts of BEP output on sideband. So we had a tremendous disadvantage against the world, but that has been rectified subsequently. And then there's QRP. Low power is 100 watt PEP output, and QRP is 5 watts of PEP output, which is quite a challenge. But nevertheless, using less than 5 watts, I've made in the order of 100 contacts per hour. So even with 5 watts of PEP output and decent antennas, it's possible to have a lot of fun. I've mentioned the exchange. I've said that you could have sequence numbers, zone numbers, and so on. Here are some examples. The first one is what one would use in the CQ Worldwide contest on phone, and we would transmit 5938, which is 59 is readability 5 and signal strength 9. 38 is zone 38, which covers all of Southern Africa. In the IARU contest, we would say 59957 on CW. That's obviously 599, the signal report, and 57 is our zone number, zone 57, which again covers all of Southern Africa. 59953, what might that be? Age, maybe. In the All Asian DX contest, you transmit your age, and the other guy transmits his age, and obviously you have to log it accurately. On a VHF contest, you might transmit 599KG44, which is my grid locator, 4-character grid locator. 599001 might be a sequence number, and the next guy might be 002, and the next guy 003, and so on. You will notice that all the signal reports are 59 or 599. Obviously, that's because my antennas are really, really good. But jokes aside, The custom is to send 59 or 599 regardless of the real RST, because logging a uniform report is so much easier in terms of the paperwork and introduces so much less of a risk of inaccuracy. Other exchanges in use are name, age, previous call sign, year license. TOK is a German club locator. It basically says where your club is located. There are other examples like your US state or your Canadian province or your Japanese prefecture or your Italian province or whatever. Depends on the rules of the contest. And the idea is simply to provide a piece of information which you have to copy accurately to get credit for a specific contact. There are often time restrictions. For example, in some contests, you're not allowed to operate the full 48 hours. You're only allowed to operate perhaps 6 hours. 36 hours. And in that case, they may have minimum break durations. So you're not allowed to take a 10-minute break here and a 15-minute break there. You have to take breaks that are at least several hours long. And this restriction introduces tremendous strategy in terms of exactly when you take your break, because if you take your break at the wrong time, you may end up missing a spectacular opening that your neighbor catches, and then you're going to pull out your hair. There are also QSY limitations. I mentioned them briefly before, but for example, in the CQ Worldwide, I'm not familiar with the very latest rules, but at least until a few years ago, there was a restriction that you were not allowed to change bands, your primary transmitter, more than once in 10 minutes. So in other words, if you move from 21 to 28 megahertz and then you make one contact and you discover that the band is not great, you can't immediately hop back to 21 megahertz. You have to stay on 28 for 10 minutes at least. So again, that really introduces some difficult decisions to be made. The scoring typically works with QSO points and multipliers, and possibly a bonus. So QSO points are often dependent on distance to some extent. In the CQ Worldwide contest, you get 1 point for your own country. You get no points at all for your own country. You get 1 point outside your own country, inside your own continent, and you get 3 points for other continents. So in our context, the scoring system is really skewed. And the reason is that we get 1 point for working someone in the Canary Islands. And he gets 1 point for working us. But he gets 3 points for working someone in Spain, who's only a few hundred kilometers away. And he also gets 3 points for working someone in the central USA, who is closer to him than we are. So in fact, 80% of the entire population of the USA is closer to him than we are, but he gets 1 point for working us, and he gets 3 points for working Europe and the USA, both of which are quite close and very, very easy to work. So the scoring system isn't entirely fair, but it works. And it has worked for almost 2/3 of a century, so I doubt if it's going to be reconsidered, because we don't want rules that are so complex that no one can actually participate unless they happen to have a PhD in contesting. The second element of the score is a multiplier. Now, for example, in the worldwide contest, the multiplier consists of the number of countries, the number of zones, the number of countries plus the number of zones that you've worked on each frequency band. So there are 40 zones, CQ zones. There might be 150 countries or so active in the contest, and so you might have a multiplier of something like 190 or so, and that gets multiplied by your QSO points. So it introduces some strategic decisions again that we will discuss in more detail later. There might also be a bonus. For example, in some contests, if you work all the possible available multipliers, you may get more credit. For example, if you're working the USA and you happen to work all 50 states plus the District of Columbia, you might get a bonus point, a few bonus points or a bonus multiplier. There's also an amazing system that they use in the Virtual Europe DX contest called QTCs. And QTCs are messages. Do you have messages for me? And I have messages for you, is what the Q code means. And the way it works is if you've worked, let's say 100 stations, and you work a strong station, then you can actually pass details of the previous QSOs along to that station and get credit for them. So let's say I've made 100 contacts and a very strong station calls in. I can say, would you like some QTCs? He would say yes, and I would give him details of 10 contacts that I've made before and get 10 points for it. So in other words, by working this strong station, I can very quickly gain 11 points instead of just getting 1 point for the contact. So QTCs are a great challenge. To be able to transmit them effectively is a challenge. But if you have a sharp operator at the other end and the signals are good, then you can earn 11 points within literally a minute or two. You have to think about the relative weight of your QSO points and your multipliers. The final score is the product of the two. And so there's an advantage in making lots and lots of contacts with lots and lots of points and also working lots of multipliers. So for example, in the worldwide contest, again, you have to make lots of contacts, mostly outside your own continent, but you also have to find lots of countries and lots of zones. And of course, if you find someone in a new country and a new zone, then that counts as a double multiplier, which really makes it worth your while. Again, we'll talk about that in more detail. The next issue to think about is running versus search and bounce. Running means you're sitting on one frequency, calling CQ, or simply just working one station after the other as they arrive. Basically, the frequency belongs to you in a sense, and you just stay on the same frequency and make lots and lots and lots of contacts. Now, to put some numbers to it, it's feasible to make about 300 contacts an hour on single sideband. Even more, but 300 is a sustainable number for a good operator using a good station into a relatively near area. For example, if you're in North Africa and you work in Europe or the US, in our case, especially on the high bands, we also have times of great signal to noise ratio where we can maintain those sort of rates. So let's say 300 contacts an hour on sideband, perhaps 200 an hour on CW, and perhaps 100 an hour on RTTY. That's running. But remember that your final score also requires a good multiplier. So you also have to work lots of multipliers. And in general, you only do that by tuning the band, finding signals, working them, and then tuning some more. So there's this constant predicament. Should I be running or should I be tuning? If you tune, you tend to work relatively few stations, and so you're not going to get lots of QSO points. If you run, you may work some multipliers, but you're probably going to miss some multipliers that may only be available by finding them and working them. And so you have to decide whether you should be calling CQ or whether you should be looking for multipliers at any given instant. The decision may change with time. For example, you may know that there's a great opening in the early evening on the high bands into the USA, and you're going to be able to work lots of people because they speak a reasonable facsimile of English. And they also have decent stations, and they have short call signs, and so you know you're going to be able to work lots and lots and lots of people. On the other hand, at sunset, you may have unique openings that only last a few minutes. For example, you may have a low band opening to the east, and you may have a high band opening into the Caribbean. And both of those may produce great multipliers. Should you be running or should you be searching and bouncing? Well, there's a solution, fortunately. You can have two radios, which means that while you're running, you are listening to the other radio and looking for multipliers. And then you quickly work the guy and then go back to your own frequency and run. So there's a whole science behind two radio operating. I used to have 3 receivers. The one receiver was to listen inside the band while I was transmitting. So let's say, for example, I was calling CQ. I had a recorded voice that would call CQ or a recorded CW message. And while the transmitter was going, I had the ability to listen inside the band with another receiver and another antenna and find multipliers. I also had a second receiver with which I could look for multipliers on the same band or another band with my left ear. So I would run with my right ear and look for multipliers with my left ear, which means that I didn't have to abandon the run. I could make lots of contacts while simultaneously finding and working lots of multipliers. You're only allowed to transmit one signal at a time. So if you find a multiplier, then you have to stop working your run. But if you are practiced enough, you can generally just disappear for a few seconds without causing too much disruption in your run, and you can maintain a rate of 250 an hour or so, while also finding perhaps 20 or 30 multipliers in that hour. So there's a lot of fun to be had. At YOTA, Youth on the Air 2018, I was invited to present something about contesting, and in fact I chopped and changed that presentation to create this one. So you will find a presentation on the internet somewhere that's essentially similar to this one. And what we did was to hold a contest inside the room. So there were perhaps 50 or so young operators or would-be operators, and we said, let's hold a contest. And the idea was to give the other person your name and the age at which you had your first license. So in my case, I would say Chris, 16. And you were not allowed to move around. So how do you win? Well, you had to learn a few tricks. One is to stand on a chair so that more people can see you and hear you. Another is to cup your hands behind your ears so that you have a bit of a directional pattern. Another is to speak in falsetto because your voice is a lot more recognizable. And of course, women have a permanent advantage in this regard. So a female contest operator can really penetrate pile-ups and even run at a much higher rate. And in that particular contest, obviously sign language was also helpful. For example, if most people knew my name because I was the guest speaker, so I had an unfair advantage in that regard. And using sign language, I could make it clear what my age had been when I was first licensed. So you kind of have to look at the rules and look at the circumstances and then figure out how to get an advantage, fair or unfair, but without violating the rules. Unfortunately, there are people who, shall we say, poke at the very edges of ethics, but generally most people play clean and abide by the rules. And generally the people who cheat don't win, and if they do, then they win only once, because then the rules get changed to patch that particular little loophole. And then their fun goes away, and then the rest of us can have more fun. Now, how to get started. So some of you have definitely had decent exposure to contesting, but I'm sure there are a few who haven't. So let's see if we can help you to get started. You need a basic antenna and a radio. Nothing fancy is needed to get started. If you want to break world records, maybe the rules will change, but initially you can get started with whatever antenna and radio you have. Second point, gather some experience. Just jump in. Read the rules. CQ Worldwide is the world's premier contest. It has tens of thousands of participants. People go to rare places and build big stations, and they are just as keen to work you as you are to work them. So you should be able to work some exotic destinations that you wouldn't even hear outside a contest. Another example is the WPX contest. The phone version is at the end of March and the CW version at the end of May every year. The CQ Worldwide, by the way, the RITI contest is at the end of September, the phone contest at the end of October, and the CW contest at the end of November every year, the last full weekend. So the dates vary a little bit, but you can always count on somewhere between, let's say, 23 and 30 November, there will be a CW contest the whole weekend, and it is a real opportunity to some very exciting operating. Worked All Europe, I think, as I recall, is around August and September. The expeditions are a great way to learn to operate. Some expeditions have huge pileups, and you need to learn how to crack those pileups. But also, you have to learn to predict propagation so that you know what time of day you ought to be looking for them. And if you work at the expedition on 5 or 6 or 7 or 8 or 9 bands, then hopefully you will have learned something about propagation. And then there are the SRL HF contests, which are very short and very intense. And they're also a lot of fun, specifically in the light of the Worked All ZS awards program. So you can come up and work lots of ZS stations quite quickly. And again, they're as keen to work you as you are to work them. So you don't need more than a few seconds to make a contact. And you can rack up, I think you could probably get very close to working all the requirements for Worked All ZS in a 3-hour period. So there's a lot of fun to be had. Now, I said there, adjust your expectations. And I learned a very valuable lesson. Once upon a time, long, long ago, when the world was still young, I was a university student. I was learning some things about electronics and antennas and how to build a competitive station. And I thought that making 1,000 contacts on a weekend was really a big deal. And I thought, wow, I'm probably the world's greatest operator, although no one has quite realized it yet. And then a German guy by the name of Roland Mensch arrived in South Africa and spent several years working in Cape Town and completely rewrote the record books. Instead of making 1,000 contacts, he was making 4,000, and with a decent multiplier. And instead of scoring 1.5 million points, he was suddenly scoring 5 million points. And I had to completely readjust my idea of what constituted a competitive score. I had acted on my peers and my elders' perceptions, and nobody had exceeded those limits previously, but suddenly a guy arrived and completely rewrote the record books. And I suddenly had to think very seriously about what it took to be competitive. And it had a startling effect on my own operating. I was suddenly able to double my scores almost instantly, simply by trying harder and by actually believing that it could be done. Now, just to quote a figure or two, I never thought it was going to be possible to break 1,000 contacts on 40 meters in a contest, because we're relatively isolated and the contest season is in our thunderstorm season, and 40 meters is quite noisy. I didn't even imagine that I would be able to break 2,000 QSOs in a CW contest and 1,000 contacts in a phone contest on 40 meters. And I forget the exact numbers, but many hundreds on gritty. So I just had to kind of figure out what was doable and do things that nobody had considered doable previously. So go and have a look at the records. I publish fairly comprehensive records on my website, but you can also see comprehensive records on the CQ Worldwide website, and you can go and have a look to see what has been done, and then figure out if you can do better. Another very important element of contesting is to stay calm. It's no use sitting there and saying, Whiskey 3 Lima, Papa Lima, you're 5938. Thank you. Good luck in the contest. 73. Thank you. Zulu Sierra 6 Echo Zulu. Because of two reasons. The one is your heart rate is going to go through the roof and you will explode. And the second reason is that your voice is not going to survive for 48 hours. So what you need to do is to listen very quickly and to speak very gently. Something like W3 Lima Papa Lima 5938. Thank you. Zulu Sierra 6 Echo Zulu. It's all about survival. And just like in a marathon, where if you start sprinting for the first kilometer, you are definitely not going to finish. Then in a 48-hour contest, you are also not going to survive by shouting. More practical operating hints. Use standard phonetics. Standard phonetics are the ICAO phonetic alphabet, Alpha, Bravo, Charlie, Delta. And people like to use very cute phonetics like Zanzibar, Santiago, 6, Boston, Canada, radio. It may be very cute, but it may not work on foreign ears. I actually fairly recently stumbled across the process that they used to develop the International Phonetic Alphabet, and it consisted of a lot of work experimenting with different people, for example, Japanese, Chinese, Americans, Spanish, Africans, Europeans, all over the place, trying to figure out which phonemes people can hear. Now, for example, you all know that a Japanese ear doesn't hear the difference between R and L. So if I say radio, you know, to them it might just as well be ladio. And if I come up with cute phonetics, it may just simply not be audible to them. They may simply not be able to distinguish. So you're actually shooting yourself in the foot by not using standard phonetics. I would strongly advocate that you use standard phonetics at all times. Use full call signs. You sometimes hear people shouting in a pile-up. Delta X-ray, Delta X-ray, Delta X-ray, Delta X-ray. Now, it's a huge waste of time from the receiving operator's point of view, because if he heard your full call sign, ZS6DX, or you know, whatever your call sign is, he could immediately come back and say ZS6DX 595. And you could go back and say 5938, and the contact is over. But now he has to go, okay, the guy with DX, what's your full call sign? And then he has to get your full call sign and then confirm, and it just wastes a lot of time. There are also legal implications. It's actually illegal to shout 2 or 3 letters without identifying your call sign, because you have to identify every transmission. So screaming X-ray Yankee Zulu, X-ray Yankee Zulu is technically illegal because your call sign hasn't been included. So use full call signs whenever you call in a pile-up. Languages, well, broken English is the standard. There is some advantage in being able to work in other languages, but generally the advantage would only apply if you've run out of people to work. So for example, if you're working the All Asian DX contest and you're working Japanese stations, then you can probably work most of them very quickly and very efficiently in English. But at some point, you're going to run out of stations, and then it becomes useful to be able to say, Zulu Sierra Loco Echo Zulu, Juliet Arapa Ichi, Juliet Romeo Kilo, Goju Kyo Sanjo Hachi Des, and, making a few contacts that way with people that may not be able to speak English at all. But in general, broken English is the standard, and you can do wonderful things with it. You can also use things like Spanish to pick up some South American multipliers, Russian to pick up some Russian multipliers. Chinese is becoming increasingly important. When I was seriously contesting, Chinese wasn't an issue yet, but right now there's quite a bit of activity in China, and there would be some advantage in being able to speak Chinese. Learn to live with QRM. If you are absolutely dependent on having full quieting FM quality and not having any interference, well, then contesting maybe isn't for you, because the bands are very, very crowded and there are a lot of very loud signals and very assertive people. And so you have to learn to live with a certain degree of QRM. And of course, that also takes practice. Stay put. I learned this lesson the hard way, but if you only operate for an hour or two and then get up and go and take a bit of a walk break, you will never win a contest. So apply bum to chair is one of the secrets of winning a contest. And I learned it running big runs into the USA, where you can work over 1,000 stations in a 4-hour period from, let's say, from sunset to about 10 p.m. or so, very quickly, very efficiently. And typically that would produce about a quarter of all the contacts that you make in an entire 48-hour contest. But if you get up, you lose your frequency, and it really has a devastating impact on your score. So you have to learn the ability to sit in your chair and to operate for 6 hours straight without budging. There are some logistical issues. You may need a bucket, or you may need to buy some accessories from the local pharmacy before the contest, but it is possible to stay in your chair for 6 hours and operate. Then, shun unnecessary talking. So it's very nice to say, good luck in the contest, 73, thanks very much, have a nice day, QRZ. But it's a lot more efficient and also very courteous to simply say, thanks, Zulu Sierra 6 Echo Zulu. Then everybody knows who you are, they know that the previous contact has been concluded, and they know they can call now, without you having to say, Roger, 73, thanks very much, good luck, have a nice day. So you can be very friendly, very efficient, very courteous, and very short. No call signs. It's extremely important to know call signs. You must, if you hear a call sign, you must know exactly where the guy is. You must know what the probability is that he is a useful multiplier. For example, Kilo Golf 4 Whiskey. You must know that he's in the southeastern US and he's not in Guantanamo Bay. If you hear Kilo Golf 4 Whiskey, you must know that he is in Guantanamo Bay and he's potentially a double multiplier, Zone 8 and Guantanamo Bay, and so on. You must also know that under US regulations, it's possible to have call signs that don't conform with a geographic distribution, and so you can have a W1 call sign in Hawaii or in Alaska or even on Baker Island. So it's even an advantage to know the particular call sign so that you know, oh, that W1 happens to be in Hawaii. You can also hear propagation changing if you understand call signs. So if you know, for example, in Europe, if you hear a Lima Zulu and you are looking for an Echo Romeo, then you know you have propagation to the area that you're looking for. Whereas if you hear a Lima Zulu, it tells you nothing about whether you're going to be able to work that elusive Charlie 3 that's also on the band. Accuracy is extremely important, and with computers, and specifically with electronically submitted logs, contests now have the ability to scrutinize accuracy very, very intensively. And I, for example, saw the bronze medal being awarded at the World Radio Sport Team Championships in 2014 because the team that was something like 5th or 6th was almost perfectly accurate. And the penalties that were applied to some of the other logs meant that people moved down from their medal positions into the also ran category simply because the other competitors were more accurate. Emphasize important stuff. As I said, using QRZ and using this ease and so on doesn't buy you any brownie points, but your call sign does. If people hear your call sign, they know exactly who you are and they know whether you're a multiplier or not, and they can decide whether to call you. So, for example, saying CQ, CQ, CQ contest, CQ, CQ, CQ contest. This is Zulu Sierra 6 Echo Zulu, over. Contains very, very little information, whereas CQ, Zulu Sierra 6 Echo Zulu, Zulu Sierra 6 Echo Zulu, Zulu Sierra 6 Echo Zulu contest contains a lot of information, and it'll get lots of people, as they tune across you, they will immediately know who you are. You must also track multipliers and duplicates. So you have to make sure whether you have worked a particular multiplier or not, and because that determines whether you're going to spend time looking for that multiplier or not, and also whether you're going to call in a pile-up or not, because if you've already worked the multiplier, there's absolutely no sense in spending time on that multiplier again. How to win. Now, this is a slightly different issue. I would say the biggest key is practice. You have to get on the air. You have to work contests. You have to work the expeditions. You have to become slick. You have to know exactly what to do. You have to have a good foot switch so that you know, so that you can minimize the amount of delay time between transmitting and receiving. You have to listen. You have to be able to pull out a full call sign out of a pile-up with no delay. You have to read. You have to listen to people who operate. You have to listen to good operators and see exactly what they're doing. You have to read. You have to read articles. You have to read on the internet. You have to read contest stories. You have to find mentors. Contest clubs are a good source of that. We don't have any really, but well, we have one contest club, but it's a little bit dormant at the moment because I am otherwise engaged, but I'm going to resurrect the Pretoria Contest Club at some point, and then we're going to do some multi-operator stories, and then a lot of people will learn a lot of things, and we will have a lot of fun. So look for a contest club, or look for like-minded people, or look for mentors. Then develop your station hardware. Figure out what you need. Do you need higher towers? Do you need more directional antennas? Do you need less directional antennas? DXing and contesting don't need the same antennas because DXing is only there to talk to one particular station. Contesting is there to talk to every station. So you can learn a lot about antenna design by looking at mobile networks rather than looking at DXing stations. You need good logging software because good logging software will help you to identify multipliers, and it will help you to ensure that you don't work the same guy over and over because you won't get credit for it. There's free logging software. There's also logging software available that you have to pay for. I don't know what the latest and greatest options are, but certainly some options include N1MM, N6TR, and so on. So there's a lot of good software floating around. Your location. Well, the really serious competitors move to be near their audience. For example, they go to North Africa or to the Caribbean, where they get 3 points for every contact, even though they're practically in Europe or practically in the USA. But in our case, at least you can look at your topography. Are you on the north side of a hill or the south side of a hill? If you're on the south side of the hill, you are not going to win the European DX contest. If you're on the north side, maybe you are. If you're in a VHF contest, you want to be on a hilltop, no doubt about it. If you're in the valley, well, you know, maybe you have a nice river next to you and it's a great place to live, but you're not going to win the VHF contest. Then strategy, band changes, rate versus multipliers. We've already talked about it to some extent, but let me give you a tangible example. At one point, I decided to break the world 10-meter record on CW. And before the contest, I looked at previous results and I decided that I was going to work 4,000 contacts on 10 meters, 40 zones and 140 countries. So my total score was going to consist of 4,000 QSOs, which would be roughly 12,000 points. A few of them might be less than 3 points per contact because I might work the odd ZS and the odd other African. But let's say 12,000 QSO points and 40 zones and 140 countries. And so my multiplier was going to be 180. So what does that mean? Well, it means that every multiplier is worth 22 contacts. So if I get towards the end of the contest, if I work one extra multiplier, it is as valuable as working 22 stations. If I work a double multiplier, so for example, I work someone in Alaska, which is in zone 1, and it's both a new zone and a new country, then I would suddenly get 88 contacts worth. In other words, it would contribute to my score to the same extent as making 44 contacts. So in that case, it's really worthwhile spending a bit of time on multipliers rather than just running. But you need to have that sort of analysis available before the contest so that you know how much time you have to spend looking for multipliers, because the ratio between contacts and multipliers will change throughout the contest. Your first 1,000 QSOs, you may have 120 multipliers, but in your last 1,000 QSOs, you may only add 2 or 3 multipliers. So the extent to which a multiplier is important is determined by your strategy. So now you know how to win a contest. Just some numbers. The most contacts that anybody has made from zone 38. Now, zone 38 is Southern Africa. It's Namibia, Botswana, South Africa, Marion Island, Gough Island, and so on. The most that anybody has made on CW in a single contest is 5,536 contacts, single operator. 5,335 on phone. Now it should be possible to make a lot more contacts on phone. So it simply means that we have underachieved on phone. On CW, that's a pretty good number. QSOs, single band, is 4,200 odd on CW and very close to 5,000 on phone, on 10 meters in both cases. So it's 5,000 QSOs on phone means an average of more than 100 contacts per hour throughout the entire 48-hour period. And don't forget, the 10-meter band isn't open 24 hours a day. So that means you have to work a lot more than 100 contacts per hour whenever the band is open. And on RTTY, 1,339 QSOs, also on 10 meters. So those are numbers that have been achieved. In principle, one should be able to achieve more than that because spotting and various other things have improved people's ability to find you. And so you could probably do bigger numbers than that. Multi-op, 6,800 odd on CW and 6,500 odd on phone. Again, those are underachieving. If we do serious multi-op contesting, we can expect to make about 10,000 contacts in a contest. Countries, single band, 149 is the record on CW, 88 on RTTY, and 152 on phone. Again, those numbers are probably subject to improvement. Zones, of the 40 zones worldwide, well, several of us have worked all 40 of them on CW or phone in a contest on a single band. which means you have to cover the entire Earth's surface during the contest. And on RTTY, the record thus far is 30, and I'm pretty certain that can be exceeded. This is evidence of compulsive behavior. This is my own station before it started deteriorating. The tower in the middle is actually a rotating tower. You can see a stationary section down below. Everything above that low triangle rotates. So you can install 4 or 5 or 6 Yagis on that tower and they all rotate together. The Yagi at the top is a 4-element 20-meter Yagi with a long boom, about 15 meters long. The Yagi on the second tower from the left is 2 elements on 80 meters and 3 elements on 40 meters. And the highest towers are around 42 meters tall. So this is the level of compulsion that I allowed myself to be drawn into when I was still a contester. You don't need that to start off with, but you know, if you eventually become sufficiently engrossed, you may end up somewhere in that sort of area. So I hope this has been enough to set the scene for discussions on contesting, and I hope that it's been useful. I certainly love to contribute more ideas and so on, so questions are welcome. You can look up my email address, or you can probably find me through other channels, and I'd love to help you come up with ideas, and I certainly hope that we can operate together in future.